welcome to the deep dive, everyone.
Glad you could join us.
Yeah, and before we even get started today, do us a massive favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to the show right now.
Seriously, you are not going to want to miss a single second of this one.
You really aren't. Today's deep dive is an ultra-long, incisive, and absolutely fascinating review of a highly controversial new ebook. It's making huge waves across the cultural landscape right now. And if you find this breakdown intriguing as we go through it, and I promise you will, you can buy the book on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
Which you should definitely do.
Right. And you absolutely should also follow the author at Conrad and Riker on Substack to see where these conversations are continuing.
Yeah, the book we are unpacking today is called Victimhood Olympics: How Feminism Rewards Complaints Over Competence. It's written by Sophie Marie Eve Riker.
Very provocative title.
Oh, incredibly provocative. And to give you, the listener, some vital context on the source material, before we really get into the weeds here, this book is explicitly written for a very specific demographic.
Right, it's not a general audience book.
Exactly. It's aimed squarely at a men's rights activist audience, often referred to as the MRA community, as well as the broader demographic, often described as red-pilled manosphere men.
So the author knows exactly who she's talking to.
She does, and her stated goal is ambitious. I mean, she wants to unpack the history of our modern institutions and lay out a comprehensive argument that these institutions have been systematically captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies over the last few decades.
And that brings us to the core mission of today's deep dive.
Yeah.
Our goal is to thoroughly unpack, analyze, and understand the arguments, the data, and the historical interpretations presented in this explosive text.
But before we dive in, we need to state a crucial, unbreakable rule for how we are approaching this material today.
Yes, very important. We're speaking directly to you, the listener. Because this book contains highly politically charged content that touches on incredibly sensitive, deeply personal societal issues, we want to make it abundantly clear that we, as your hosts, are taking absolutely no sides today.
None at all. Our role here is strictly analytical. We are impartially recording the contents provided in the text.
Right. We're not endorsing the viewpoints, the politics, or the conclusions of the author. We're simply trying to convey the ideas, the data points, and the arguments exactly as they are contained in the original source material.
We want to give you a clear, unfiltered, and deeply detailed look at what this book is arguing, how it constructs those arguments, and what evidence it uses. That way, you can understand the perspective it brings to the broader cultural conversation.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The book kicks off with a massive central thesis. Riker argues that modern feminism has completely transitioned away from being a movement for equality.
Yeah.
Instead, she claims it has morphed into what she explicitly calls a protection racket. She argues that this new iteration of the movement actively prioritizes victimhood over competence.
According to the text, the traditional concept of empowerment has been entirely replaced by the infantilization of women.
I want to make sure I'm following the author's logic right out of the gate here. How exactly does she define this transition from empowerment to infantilization?
It all comes down to the concept of meritocracy, which is really the foundational pillar of her first section.
Right.
Riker frames this shift by dedicating a significant amount of time to dismantling what she calls the quota con. She argues that diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI initiatives, alongside strict top-down gender quotas, are actively destroying meritocracy in the modern workplace.
So she's saying the best person isn't getting the job anymore.
Exactly. Her perspective is that forcing unqualified or less qualified people into roles just to meet a predetermined demographic target isn't social progress. In fact, she refers to it as professional Russian roulette.
Wow. Professional Russian roulette.
Yeah. The argument is that true empowerment is the ability to compete on an even playing field, whereas infantilization is the assumption that women cannot succeed without institutional safety nets and mandated quotas.
And she brings in some very specific, high-profile anecdotes to illustrate this, doesn't she? There's a story early on about a SpaceX engineer named Alicia Martinez.
Yeah, that's a cornerstone example in the first chapter.
According to the book, Martinez was a powerhouse. I mean, she graduated at the absolute top of her class at MIT.
Top of her class.
But the book claims she allegedly resigned in 2022. And the context provided is that HR instituted a strict 30% female hiring quota.
Right, and after that policy went into effect, Martinez felt her coworkers started treating her differently. The text says they started viewing her as nothing more than a DEI checkbox.
So all her actual achievements were just erased in the eyes of her peers.
Yes, and Riker uses the Martinez anecdote to illustrate a specific psychological phenomenon. The author argues that when you enforce quotas from the top down, the competence of genuinely qualified, brilliant women becomes collateral damage.
Because everyone just assumes you're the quota hire.
Precisely. Their actual hard-earned achievements get completely overshadowed by the lingering assumption that they were only hired or promoted to fill a mandated quota. Riker is essentially arguing that quotas don't just harm the men who are passed over.
They actively undermine the respect and authority of the women who didn't actually need them in the first place.
Exactly.
Wait, I want to pause there and look at the macro data, because she doesn't just rely on individual anecdotes like Martinez. She scales this up to a global economic level. The book cites Norway's implementation of a 40% corporate board gender quota.
It does.
Does the text provide data to prove that the quota directly caused a negative economic impact, or is she just pointing out a correlation?
She points to a very specific set of macroeconomic outcomes. According to the text, within 5 years of Norway legally mandating that 40% board quota, corporate profits for those specific companies fell by 10%.
10% is a massive drop for top-tier corporations.
It's huge. And Riker uses this to argue that when you artificially restrict the talent pool to meet a gender ratio, you inevitably dilute the executive competence of the board. And that directly impacts the bottom line.
Makes sense from a purely numerical standpoint.
Right. And she then links this to an even older historical example to show a pattern. She brings up the USSR's push for absolute gender parity in the 1970s.
I found that USSR example fascinating. What exactly happened there, according to the book?
The author claims that the Soviet government's rigid enforcement of gender parity across various industrial sectors resulted in a staggering 30% drop in overall industrial productivity.
30%. That's catastrophic.
Yeah, she even cites a description from the Moscow Economic Journal at the time, which retrospectively referred to the policy as industrial castration.
That is some intense terminology.
Well, the mechanism she's highlighting is that the state prioritized an ideological illusion of equality over the gritty reality of who was actually best suited, physically or technically, to do the grueling industrial work.
So if that is the author's definition of failure, who does she point to as an example of success? Because she must provide a countermodel of what she considers true meritocracy.
She does. She points heavily to Margaret Thatcher.
Okay, the Iron Lady.
Right. Riker argues that Thatcher clawed her way to becoming the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom through sheer grit, intellect, and ruthlessness. The author claims that these are the exact traits that modern feminism now pathologizes as toxic masculinity.
Interesting. So she's saying Thatcher succeeded using the very tools feminism now condemns.
Exactly. Riker notes that Thatcher didn't need a quota to shatter the highest glass ceiling in Europe. The text also points to Japan's notoriously competitive tech sector.
What's the data there?
Riker claims that 85% of female engineers in that specific sector are promoted through grueling, standardized skill tests. There are no what she calls pity points, and she argues they thrive on a global level specifically because they do not rely on or even tolerate victim narratives.
That sets up a huge philosophical question that the author poses to the reader. She asks, what happens when woke capitalism self-destructs because competence becomes optional?
It's the core question of the first section.
If you look at how she structures this chapter, she's really asking you to consider the long-term implications for institutional trust. If the public, the consumers, and the workforce start to believe that merit has been entirely abandoned in favor of identity politics, the text argues that the very foundation of these institutions will crumble.
Yes.
The author asserts that quotas merely turn workplaces into environments where average, compliant performance is rewarded, and true, disruptive, hard-earned talent is completely overlooked.
And if we follow the author's logic, if this shift from meritocracy to identity-based victimhood is happening today, it requires a massive ideological justification. You can't just flip a society's values overnight without a compelling narrative.
Like, people would just accept it.
Exactly. And that thematic bridge leads us directly into her next major section. Riker argues that to justify this modern focus on victimhood, ideological frameworks have had to actively rewrite history.
Rewriting history. How so?
The claim is that historical narratives have been meticulously altered to paint women as perpetual helpless victims and men as perpetual ruthless oppressors.
And in doing so, the author says this rewritten history completely erases a concept she terms civilizational altruism.
Let's dive deep into that because civilizational altruism seems to be the philosophical core of this entire book. How does she define it?
Riker defines civilizational altruism as the historical reality that male sacrifice, physical bodily sacrifice, literally built the infrastructure of the modern world.
Physical sacrifice,
Yeah.
like labor and war.
Yes, the author contends that modern feminism requires exaggerating historical female oppression to justify the accumulation of modern victim points.
Right, if you were historically oppressed, you're owed something today. That's the logic she's critiquing. If women were always oppressed, the logic goes, then modern institutions owe them infinite reparations in the form of quotas and social deference. Furthermore, the book claims that the movement actively silences or cancels anyone who tries to point out instances of historical female success or, crucially, historical male suffering.
The book points to some really famous cultural touchstones to make this point, and she calls them outright fabricated myths. For example, she brings up the famous 1968 Miss America bra burning protest. I think most people have a vivid mental image of that event.
Oh, absolutely. It's iconic.
But what does the author claim actually happened?
The author notes that literally 0 bras were burned that day in 1968.
Wait, none.
0. They were thrown into what protesters called a freedom trash can, alongside high heels and makeup, but no fire was ever lit. There was no burning.
So where did the image come from?
Yet, according to the text, the New York Times and other major media outlets essentially created the enduring, fiery myth of the bra-burning radical feminist because, as Riker puts it, drama fuels revolutions.
That's a great quote. Drama fuels revolutions.
The author is using this to show how media curation creates historical memory, even when that memory is factually bankrupt.
And she points out a similar fabrication regarding the wage gap, right? This is a massive talking point in cultural debates today. The text details a specific event in 1974 in Detroit. According to Riker, organizers allegedly paid unemployed actors $15 an hour to waive fake paychecks labeled 59 cents at public rallies.
Yes.
This created a powerful, undeniable visual for the cameras, and the media ran with it as absolute fact.
She argues that the 59 cents on the dollar narrative was born from theatrical protest, not economic reality.
So what's her counter data?
To counter the narrative, Riker doesn't just rely on her own opinion. She cites the 2009 CONSAD report. This was a massive, comprehensive study actually commissioned by the U.S. Department of Labor.
So official government data.
Exactly. The report found that when you don't just look at raw aggregate earnings, but actually control for specific variables like occupation choice, the number of hours worked per week, danger pay, and voluntary career breaks for childcare, the gap virtually disappears.
What does it shrink down to?
Women, according to the report she cites, earn 97 cents to every dollar a man earns when doing the exact same work under the exact same conditions.
97 cents. That is a vastly different picture than 59 cents.
The author uses this disparity between the 59-cent myth and the 97-cent reality to argue that the movement relies on emotional theater rather than factual data.
But the author goes even further back than the 1970s. She talks about the active erasure of female success in deep history to maintain the helpless victim narrative. Riker brings up the witch trials, which are always framed as the ultimate historical war on women.
Always.
But she specifically cites court records from Essex, England. What do those records show?
The Essex records, she highlights, point out that 23% of the people accused and executed for witchcraft were actually men, and some of them were as young as 10 years old.
23%. You never hear that statistic.
Riker is arguing that history is complex and brutal for everyone, but ideological narratives cherry-pick the female victims to create a gendered narrative of oppression.
She also highlights Marjorie Kemp, which is a fascinating historical deep cut. Kempe was a 15th century English merchant. According to the book, she ran a highly successful brewing empire, massively out-earned her husband, traveled across Europe and the Middle East independently, and dictated the first autobiography in the English language.
It's an incredible story.
The author uses Kemp to totally debunk the narrative of the helpless historical woman, arguing that pre-industrial Europe was actually full of women running guilds, managing estates, and driving business.
Exactly. Riker is arguing that the idea that women were basically house pets until the 1960s is an intentional historical distortion. But the heaviest, most sobering statistics in this section focus on male sacrifice, which brings us back to civilizational altruism.
Right.
To support this theory, the author drops some staggering numbers regarding what she calls the blood tax paid by men.
Let's lay those numbers out because they are intense. The text notes that right now, today, men make up 93% of all workplace fatalities.
93%.
They are the ones dying on oil rigs, deep-sea fishing boats, logging sites, and high-voltage power lines. Historically, the book points out that 96% of Civil War casualties were male. She even goes back to antiquity, referencing the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE, where the Roman army suffered an 80% casualty rate in a single afternoon.
Tens of thousands of men slaughtered in hours.
Riker frames this as a purely male blood tax required to sustain civilization. And on the innovation side, she claims that men have invented 97% of all patented technologies that make modern life comfortable and safe.
So the author is really challenging you, the reader, to ponder a deeply uncomfortable question. If the very scaffolding of our society, our physical infrastructure, our safety, our technological progress relies on this historical and ongoing male sacrifice, what happens when a culture decides to rebrand that exact same sacrifice, that same masculine drive, as toxic masculinity?
It's a profound shift in cultural narrative.
Yeah.
And Riker argues that once you rewrite history to establish a perpetual, flawless victim class and pathologize the builders and protectors, you open the door to monetizing that victimhood.
Yes.
That is the thematic bridge that transitions us directly into the book's blistering, highly controversial critique of the modern victimhood industry and its specific focus on the weaponization of the Me Too movement.
This is where the author's language becomes incredibly sharp. The source material argues that victimhood isn't just a social ideology anymore. It has been institutionalized into a highly lucrative industry.
A literal industry.
Exactly. Riker makes the explosive claim that false allegations are not a rare bug in the system of modern feminism, but a core feature. They are allegedly used as a deliberate, calculated tool to gain social capital, destroy professional rivals, and generate massive financial profit.
The book heavily critiques the Believe All Women movement. Now, the language used here is intentionally explosive. Riker frames this mantra not as a noble pursuit of justice for survivors, but as emotional blackmail.
Emotional blackmail.
By using that phrase, she is arguing that the movement demands the complete subversion of legal due process. She specifically targets campus Title IX tribunals. Before we get into how the book claims it's weaponized, let's quickly clarify for the listener. Title IX was originally passed to ensure equal opportunity in education, specifically regarding funding and access. How exactly does the author argue it morphed into what she calls Stalinist show trials?
Riker argues that under the guise of enforcing Title IX, universities created parallel, pseudo-legal justice systems on college campuses to handle allegations of sexual misconduct.
Without actual judges or lawyers.
Right. She compares them to Stalinist show trials because, according to the text, the accused male students are systematically denied basic legal rights. They are often presumed guilty. They are frequently denied the right to cross-examine their accusers. Exculpatory evidence is routinely ignored by university panels, and the mob's verdict on social media is treated as more important than empirical truth.
So she's saying the whole concept of innocent until proven guilty is just thrown out the window.
Riker argues this is a subversion of the entire Western legal tradition.
The book pulls no punches with its examples here. It dives into several high-profile cases to illustrate this alleged grift. It brings up Emma Solkovich, the Columbia University student, who famously carried a mattress around campus to protest her alleged rapist.
Right, the mattress girl case.
This became a global news story. But what does the author point out about the aftermath of that case?
The author points out that official university and police investigators found Solkovich's story riddled with contradictions and exculpatory messages. The accused student was cleared and eventually won a massive settlement from Columbia University for how they treated him.
A massive settlement.
Yet, Riker notes, Solkovich still gained massive social capital, gallery shows, invitations to the State of the Union, and endless media praise. The author uses this to argue that the truth didn't matter. The performance of victimhood was what was rewarded.
Riker also points to the fabricated Rolling Stone article, A Rape on Campus, about a UVA fraternity. That story was explosive, but it was entirely retracted after police found absolutely zero evidence that the horrific event ever occurred. The journalist had simply believed the narrative without verifying it.
Because of the believe all women pressure?
Exactly. The book also discusses the Duke lacrosse case from the 2000s, where the accused players were entirely exonerated by DNA evidence, yet were globally shamed by the media, professors, and activists who rushed to judgment.
And of course, the book extensively references the cultural watershed moment of Amber Heard's trial against Johnny Depp.
Everyone remembers that one.
Riker notes that despite leaked audio of Heard explicitly admitting to hitting Depp and mocking him for claiming he was a victim of domestic violence, major feminist organizations and media outlets continued to support her. Furthermore, the text points out that Heard was able to leverage her victim status to crowdfund hundreds of thousands of dollars for her legal fees.
Right.
Riker uses this to illustrate the financial and social insulation provided to women who make allegations, regardless of the evidence against them.
Let's talk about the specific financial critique the author lays out regarding the organizations behind these movements, because the numbers she cites are staggering. She claims that the Me Too nonprofit paid its top executives around $480,000 annually, while directing under 10% of its massive fundraising haul to actual survivors or grassroots support programs.
It gets even more pointed when she takes aim at the Time's Up organization, which was heavily backed by Hollywood elites. Riker claims they hoarded roughly $24 million intended for legal defense funds for vulnerable women.
24 million.
Yet, according to the book's analysis of their tax filings, they distributed less than 1% of those funds to actual victims. They spent the vast majority on lavish executive salaries, luxury retreats, and PR spin.
Less than 1%.
The author argues this proves the movement is a grift, a corporate entity wearing the skin of a grassroots civil rights movement.
But the core of this chapter hinges on the prevalence of false allegations. To back up the claim that false allegations are a systemic, weaponized issue, the author cites a National Academy of Sciences review of 2,500 rape claims. What did that review actually find?
According to the text, that specific review allegedly found that between 8% and 41% of those claims were provably false, meaning police found objective evidence that the crime did not happen.
Up to 41%.
Yet, Riker argues, major media outlets continually report that the false accusation rate is a flat, negligible 2%. Riker refers to this media reporting as statistical alchemy, arguing that the media intentionally conflates unproven cases with provably false cases to unofficially suppress the reality of how often allegations are fabricated.
So what is the real-world consequence of all this fear and statistical manipulation, according to the book? The author warns that it has created a pervasive surveillance state in the modern workplace.
Yes.
She cites data claiming that 78% of men now actively avoid working alone with female colleagues, mentoring them, or traveling with them, due to the sheer existential fear of false allegations.
The Mike Pence rule basically becoming the corporate standard.
Exactly. The author's argument is that you simply cannot have genuine workplace collaboration or mentorship when one half of the workforce views the other half as a walking, talking legal liability.
And this is where the author pivots from the professional sphere to the private sphere. If the workplace has become a legally fraught minefield, the book argues that the home, the building block of society, is an active war zone.
Right.
This brings us directly to the author's intense, highly detailed critique of family courts, which she labels the divorce cartel, and the subsequent rise of what she calls the daddy state.
Yeah, the rhetoric here shifts into an incredibly intense gear. The book literally paints family courts as feminist gulags. Again, let's analyze the rhetorical purpose of such extreme language. By framing family courts as gulags, the author is trying to forcefully shift the reader's perspective from viewing divorce as a mundane, sad administrative process to viewing it as a systemic, punitive human rights violation against men.
The central claim here is that the government, incentivized by ideology, has effectively replaced biological fathers with welfare checks.
Let's dig into that.
Riker provides a very detailed historical critique of what she terms the divorce industrial complex. She traces this back to the advent of no-fault divorce laws. She argues that no-fault divorce, when combined with the threat of lifetime alimony, functions as state-sponsored slavery.
Because the man is locked into paying forever regardless of who ended the marriage.
Right. The book presents harrowing examples of fathers working grueling 60-hour weeks in dangerous professions just to pay $3,000 a month in alimony to ex-wives who are perfectly capable of working but refuse to do so.
To back this up, the text points out some heavily skewed statistics. She notes that women initiate between 68% and 70% of all divorces.
Wow.
Furthermore, despite changes in cultural attitudes toward fatherhood, mothers still win primary custody of children in 80% to 90% of all cases. Riker argues this isn't because men don't want to be fathers. It's because the courts have an inherent systemic bias that views women as caregivers and men merely as walking wallets.
The author then links this destruction of the nuclear family directly to the welfare system, which she derisively calls the daddy state. The argument is that vast welfare programs actually incentivize single motherhood and financially penalize marriage to the extreme, measurable detriment of children.
And she has data for that, right?
To illustrate this devastating social cost, the book cites a terrifying statistic from Baltimore. Riker claims that a staggering 70% single mother rate in the city correlates directly with a 300% spike in violent teen crime.
300%. She also cites Department of Health and Human Services data claiming that kids raised by single moms are 5 times more likely to end up in the foster care system, drastically more likely to drop out of high school, and more likely to end up incarcerated.
Right.
The author is essentially arguing that the state pays women to kick fathers out of the home, and society reaps a whirlwind of broken children as a result.
And then the book tackles perhaps the most taboo, controversial topic in the entire text, paternity fraud. Riker discusses the advent of the $99 over-the-counter DNA test. She frames this cheap, accessible technology as a massive truth bomb that is currently disrupting the entire family court system. The author expresses absolute outrage over legal concepts like paternity by estoppel.
For the listener who might not be familiar with family law, what exactly is paternity by estoppel?
It is a legal doctrine that can literally force a man to pay child support for a child that a DNA test definitively proves is not biologically his.
Even if he has scientific proof.
Even with proof. The courts justify this by saying that if the man acted as the father for a certain period of time, he is legally estopped or prevented from denying financial responsibility later, regardless of the biological truth or the mother's deception.
That's intense.
Riker frames this as the state prioritizing the financial convenience of the mother over the basic human rights and truth of the defrauded man.
She points out an incredible international detail to highlight how deeply entrenched this system is. In places like France and Germany, taking a private, at-home DNA test to check paternity without a court order is actually illegal.
Illegal.
It carries heavy fines or even jail time. Riker frames this as the European state actively enforcing a maternal secrecy racket, essentially arguing that the government is protecting women's infidelity at the expense of men's right to know if a child is theirs.
And regarding the scale of this issue, while the baseline generally accepted cuckoldry rate is often cited by sociologists as 1% to 3%, the author claims that in certain demographics it is astronomically higher.
What numbers does she use?
She cites a specific study from Jamaica where 60% of fathers who submitted to paternity testing discovered they were not biologically related to the children they were raising. Riker suggests that without mandatory testing, the true global rate is a heavily guarded secret.
So, after laying out this dystopian view of the family court system, what are the author's solutions? She doesn't just complain, she offers a specific legislative roadmap. First, Riker advocates for contractual fatherhood agreements, essentially legally binding preconception waivers that outline exact financial and physical responsibilities, treating reproduction like a serious legal contract rather than a romantic accident.
Second, she argues for mandatory DNA testing at birth for every single child born in a hospital to establish biological truth immediately and prevent fraud before bonding occurs.
That would definitely change things.
Finally, she highly praises recent legislation in Florida that officially abolished lifetime alimony. She frames that new law as a necessary, monumental first step to stop the lifelong financial exploitation of men in family courts.
So if the author is arguing that the home has been completely destabilized by these legal frameworks, it naturally raises the question of where those children, raised in that chaos, go next. The school system. And that brings us directly to what the book calls the war on boys and the capture of academia.
Right. Riker argues that from the finger painting of preschool to the defense of a PhD dissertation in graduate school, educational institutions have been completely transformed into indoctrination camps.
Indoctrination camps.
The core claim is that masculinity itself, the natural energy, competitiveness, and stoicism of boys is being systematically pathologized, and boys are being intentionally disadvantaged at every single level of education.
A major undeniable focus of this section is the modern application of Title IX in athletics. We'd touched on Title IX earlier regarding campus tribunals, but here Riker asserts that in the realm of sports, Title IX has morphed from a noble equality measure into a strict punitive quota system.
Yes. She argues it is used to intentionally gut men's collegiate athletics to artificially balance the books. The book claims that over 20,000 male collegiate athletic spots have been completely eradicated since 1980.
20,000. She uses a very specific, heartbreaking example to ground this statistic. The author looks at James Madison University, which allegedly cut 10 separate men's athletic teams in 2006. This included highly successful, low-cost sports like wrestling and swimming.
And why did they cut them?
Riker points out that these teams were not cut due to a lack of student interest, and they weren't cut due to a lack of funding. Alumni even offered to privately fund the teams. They were cut solely to meet federal gender ratios dictated by Title IX. The author argues this is institutionalized discrimination against young men under the guise of equity.
And the author claims this war isn't just happening on the athletic field, it begins in the earliest classrooms. The book claims that modern early education run overwhelmingly by female teachers heavily favors female learning styles.
Which are?
These styles are defined as quiet compliance, sitting perfectly still, and verbal processing. Meanwhile, the system actively punishes boys for having natural, boisterous physical energy.
The book has a stunning stat on that.
Yes. The author highlights a stunning, terrifying claim that boys are 4 times more likely to be prescribed heavy ADHD medication for behaviors that, 50 years ago, were just considered normal, healthy, boyish energy.
Riker essentially argues that we are legally drugging boys to make them act more like girls in the classroom. The author also shares a chilling anecdote about a California high school that allegedly replaced the traditional title of valedictorian with vaguely defined equity certificates. Why? Simply because the top 3 academically ranked students that particular year happened to be boys.
Unbelievable.
Riker argues that this is a system that literally steals earned, objective recognition to soothe feminist egos and prevent male excellence from being celebrated.
When the book moves from high school to higher education, the author does not hold back. She explicitly labels university gender studies departments as an academic cancer.
An academic cancer.
She doesn't just throw that term out. She cites a University of Michigan study claiming that an astonishing 78% of gender studies papers cite absolutely zero empirical data. They rely entirely on self-referential theory and personal grievance.
So no hard science backing them up.
The author argues that it's a political ideology masquerading as a rigorous academic discipline, using taxpayer and tuition money to launder radical theories into mainstream culture.
To illustrate the absolute ideological capture of universities, the book points to figures like Dr. Jordan Peterson. Riker details how Peterson faced massive, career-threatening backlash and legal threats in Canada simply for refusing to use state-compelled pronouns, arguing he was defending basic free speech.
Right.
The text also highlights the case of Lindsay Shepard, a young teaching assistant who was secretly recorded and disciplined by her university professors, basically interrogated like a criminal, merely for showing a neutral, televised clip of Peterson in a communications class.
Riker frames these as glaring examples of academics being punished by a system that acts more like a religious cult enforcing dogma than a traditional place of free inquiry.
So you have to consider the author's ultimate connection here. She links these deeply ingrained educational policies, the drugging of young boys, and the constant, relentless pathologizing of male behavior to severe, catastrophic, real-world outcomes.
The statistics are grim.
She points to a 60% increase in male suicide rates since the year 2000. She also points to a devastating 15% drop in men's prime-age labor participation since 1980. The author is arguing that you simply cannot strip purpose, physical outlets, and objective merit away from half the population, label them toxic, and then act surprised when they completely drop out of society, either economically or, tragically, through suicide.
It is a bleak picture of institutional failure, but this systemic critique smoothly and surprisingly transitions into the author's examination of the ideological fractures happening within feminism itself.
The movement turning on itself.
Exactly. In a section dealing with intersectionality, what she calls the transgender Trojan horse and feminist colonialism, Riker claims that feminism's long-standing alliance with Marxism has created an internal oppression Olympics. And the irony, she argues, is that this point system of victimhood is currently tearing the feminist movement apart from the inside.
Let's unpack the concept of intersectionality first, because it's crucial to understanding this chapter. In the context of the book, intersectionality is described as a framework where different forms of oppression, race, gender, class intersect to create a hierarchy of victimhood.
But Riker argues this created a system where the most marginalized identity wields the most power. And that leads directly to her concept of the transgender Trojan horse.
This is a major, highly volatile part of her argument. The book claims that by spending decades arguing that biological sex is merely a social construct to fight the patriarchy, feminists inadvertently unlock the gates and open the door for biological males to dominate women's safe spaces, sports, and prisons.
And now, the author says, the ideological monster they created has led to a circular firing squad within the movement.
The text details the so-called turf wars, TERF, standing for trans-exclusionary radical feminist. Riker discusses the spectacular fall from grace of J.K. Rowling. Here was a woman who was once a beloved, universally praised feminist icon, yet she was viciously labeled a bigot, faced death threats, and was ostracized by the very actors she helped make famous, simply for stating that biological sex is real and that erasing it harms women.
The book provides numerous examples of biological males dominating women's sports to illustrate this ideological contradiction. Riker points to collegiate swimmer Leah Thomas, who went from being a mediocre male swimmer to a national champion in the female division, and MMA fighter Fallon Fox, a biological male who literally fractured the skull of a female opponent in the ring.
Those are high-profile cases.
She goes further. Riker also highlights the horrifying case of Karen White, a biological male with a documented history of sexual assault, who was placed in a UK women's prison based on self-identification and subsequently sexually assaulted multiple female inmates. Riker argues that feminist ideology paved the way for this exact abuse.
The author also accuses mainstream intersectional feminism of actively silencing and burying the stories of detransitioners, young women who deeply regret medically transitioning. She heavily features figures like Chloe Cole, who had irreversible surgeries as a teenager and is now speaking out against the medical establishment.
Furthermore, she cites the immense backlash against Dr. Lisa Lippman. Dr. Lippman published a peer-reviewed study on rapid onset gender dysphoria, which suggested that social contagion, internet culture, and peer pressure might be causing a massive spike in teen girls suddenly identifying as trans.
And how did the movement react?
According to the book, rather than debating the science, trans activists and intersectional feminists relentlessly bullied the academic journal that published Lippman's study until they caved, because her empirical data threatened their fragile ideological narrative.
Beyond the deeply fraught gender debates, the book explores the concept of feminist colonialism. This is a fascinating critique of Western privilege. Riker critiques affluent Western feminists for engaging in what she calls poverty porn.
Basically using the horrific struggles of women in the developing world to raise funds and awareness for their NGOs while ignoring those actual horrific atrocities in their day-to-day activism.
The text points out the blinding hypocrisy of Western feminists hyper-focusing on trivial issues, like manspreading on the subway or corporate microaggressions, while remaining deafeningly silent about the Boko Haram kidnappings of schoolgirls in Nigeria or the estimated 336 million forced abortions carried out under the brutal enforcement of China's one-child policy.
336 million.
The author is asking how a movement can claim to care about women while ignoring the state-sponsored slaughter of hundreds of millions of female infants. She even quotes Malala Yousafzai, the Nobel laureate who survived a Taliban assassination attempt, speaking about Western feminists. Malala simply said, "They lecture, they don't listen."
It really prompts you to step back and think about the author's underlying sociological theory here. She proposes a fundamental law of political movements. When a movement is built entirely on the concept of identifying oppressors and ranking victimhood, rather than building shared values, it is inevitable that the movement will eventually run out of external enemies and turn violently on itself.
Which brings us to the book's final, overarching, and perhaps most apocalyptic thematic pillar. Riker concludes the book by examining what she views as the ultimate existential consequence of this 50-year ideology, its catastrophic effect on global birth rates and the future survival of civilization itself.
The author titles this final section, The Birth Strike Bomb. The book concludes that feminism's relentless, decades-long push for women to prioritize corporate careers and consumerism over building families is leading to demographic suicide across the developed world.
The author argues that women have been sold a massive, destructive lie about what true empowerment and happiness actually look like, and that this lie ultimately only enriches two entities: soulless corporate interests and the multi-billion-dollar abortion industry.
Riker introduces a socio-economic concept she calls the tampon tax. This isn't about literal taxes on feminine products. It is her assertion that women are constantly fed corporate, careerist propaganda, convincing them to delay or entirely forego motherhood in pursuit of climbing a corporate ladder that will never love them back.
Right.
The text points to alarming CDC data showing that childless women over the age of 40 have significantly, measurably higher rates of clinical depression, anxiety, and SSRI usage than their married with children counterparts.
Roker aggressively contrasts the misery of the modern girl boss lifestyle with older traditions. She talks about the bleak reality of women spending $50,000 to medically freeze their eggs because they prioritized a middle management job in their 20s. Or the dystopian reality in highly modernized cities like Seoul, South Korea, where the birth rate has plummeted so low that registered pets now vastly outnumber human babies.
Pets outnumbering babies. Let that sink in.
She contrasts this corporate burnout with a return to traditional pro-family structures.
And the book's critique of the abortion industry in this context is absolutely scathing. Riker claims that organizations like Planned Parenthood, which she notes generates a staggering $1.7 billion annually, treat abortion not as a tragic medical necessity, but as a corporate sales quota. The author alleges that the industry intentionally buries massive amounts of data regarding post-abortion depression, trauma, and regret, simply to keep their lucrative profit machine running smoothly.
To offer an alternative to this bleak demographic winter, the book highlights the viral TikTok tradwife movement. Riker doesn't view this as a weird internet subculture. She frames it as a genuine organic rebellion by young women against corporate feminist burnout. They're actively choosing home, family, and traditional roles over the cubicle.
She backs up the value of this traditional structure with science. Riker cites a fascinating New England Journal of Medicine study showing that grandmothers who actively babysit their grandchildren cut their own risk of developing Alzheimer's and dementia by an incredible 40%. The author is arguing that human biology, mental health, and multi-generational family structures are deeply, inextricably intertwined, and feminism has severed that vital connection.
And she doesn't just point to individuals, she points to entire nations fighting back. The author points to Hungary as the ultimate model for the future of Western civilization. She claims that by implementing aggressive pro-family policies, most notably offering a permanent, lifetime income tax exemption for any woman who has 4 or more children, Hungary boosted its national birth rate by 21% in just a few years. Furthermore, the text claims they even saw a measurable increase in cognitive test scores for children raised in those newly stabilized, heavily supported families.
So bringing it all together, the author's ultimate call to action for you, the reader, is to completely and unapologetically reject the victim script. She demands a return to strict, uncompromising meritocracy in our institutions. She encourages the embrace and celebration of traditional gender roles. And she asks society to finally recognize, honor, and reward the fact that masculinity is society's scaffolding.
As we summarize this incredibly intense, sweeping, and challenging journey through this highly controversial book, we must remind you one final time. We, as your hosts, have been impartially laying out Sophie Marie Eve Riker's arguments, her data points, and her historical interpretations regarding the capture of modern institutions.
Yeah. We have deeply analyzed the text provided to understand its mechanics, but we are absolutely not taking a side in this highly charged, ongoing cultural debate.
Absolutely. We are just the guides to the material, helping you unpack how the author constructs her worldview. But to leave you with a final provocative thought that builds on everything we've discussed today, a thought not explicitly stated in the source, but looming over it.
Let's hear it.
If we accept the book's premise that our cultural narratives have been heavily curated, manipulated, and altered by ideological frameworks over the last 50 years, what is the deep psychological toll on an entire generation of young men and women? They must now navigate a world where they are fundamentally taught by the media, by the courts, and by their universities to view each other not as complementary partners necessary for survival, but as inherent political adversaries.
It is a profound question. How does a society effectively de-escalate a gender war when the battle lines have been deliberately drawn through the middle of our homes, our family courts, and our children's classrooms?
It's a question that requires stepping far outside the immediate heated arguments of the book to consider the broader, long-term human impact of this relentless cultural friction.
Something incredibly heavy for you to mull over as you go about your day.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Please do not forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the show to support what we do here. And remember, if you want to read the source material for yourself, dive into the author's citations and examine the data firsthand, you absolutely should check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the ebook Victimhood Olympics. And be sure to follow the author at Conrad N. Ranker on Substack to stay updated on her latest writing. We will see you next time.